are in the miscellaneous area, and we're dealing with miscellaneous issues. Solomon will continue to use the ancient old teaching tool of contrast and comparison. I can't say that enough, because throughout the miscellaneous section, or the section that deals with miscellaneous issues, Solomon continues to use contrast and comparison. Of course, when we talk about contrast, we're looking for differences. When we talk about comparison, we're looking for similarities, things that are similar or the same, if you will. And Solomon, what he does, and he does it very well, he contrasts and compares the righteous with the unrighteous. He contrasts and compares the godly with the ungodly. He contrasts and compares those who are bent on doing what's right and those who are bent on doing what's wrong. He uses the ancient old teaching tool of contrast and comparison. With that said, let's begin our formal study tonight in chapter 18. I'm excited about our study tonight because I believe that this study will be both hopeful and helpful to our daily lives. Now, pay close attention to the fact that Solomon in chapter 18, his focus is on building character. Throughout the verses found in chapter 18, verses 1 through 24, you'll discover that Solomon's focus throughout chapter 18 is on building character. Building character. And of course, in order to build character, you have to start on the inside. And starting on the inside, it works itself to the outside. Matter of fact, beloved, Christianity can be summed up in these words. Christianity, in a real sense, is an inside job. Did you hear what I just said? Christianity, in a real sense, is an inside job. An inside job. Let's begin, if you will, with verse number 1. Verse number 1. In verse number 1, Solomon begins his focus on building character, building us up on the inside, if you will. He's talking about the how-tos of building character. He shares with us the building blocks of building a strong spiritual character, a strong spiritual character. Now, listen, in verse number 1, here we go. Get your pencil and paper. It's very important that you get these concepts from the outset. In verse number 1, Solomon introduces us to the separated man. Look at verse number 1 in chapter 18, and you'll discover that Solomon's focus in verse 1 is on the separated man, the separated man. In verse number 2, he deals and introduces us to the selfish man, the selfish man. In verse number 3, he introduces us to the sinful man, the sinful man. Then, in verse number 4 through 8, he's going to talk to us about the speaking man, the speaking man. Then in verse number 9, he introduces us to the slothful man, the slothful man. So let's look again at Solomon's layout for chapter 18, verses 1 through 9. He begins in verse 1 with the separated man, the separated man. Then he talks to us in verse 2 about the selfish man, the selfish man. Then, of course, in verse number 3, he talks to us about the sinful man. Then verses 4 through 8, the focus is on the speaking man. And then in verse number 9, he's going to talk to us about the slothful man. So let's go again and focus our attention on verse number 1. Here, beloved, we come face to face, eyeball to eyeball with the separated man. Let's look at verse number 1, if you will, in chapter 18 of the book of Proverbs. Solomon says these words: through desire, a man having separated himself seeketh, intermeddleth with all wisdom. Let's read it once again. Through desire, a man having separated himself seeketh and intermeddleth with all wisdom. All wisdom. All wisdom. Now, here's what Solomon does in verse number 1. He's talking about, remember, he's talking about the separated man in verse number 1. And he uses an old archaic English word, intermeddleth. Intermeddleth. Let's unpack this and see what Solomon is trying to say to us in these last and evil days. Let's look at some historicity, if you will, in verse number 1 of chapter 18 of the book of Proverbs. Please remember, beloved, and this is just some information that will be helpful in understanding the Word of God if you're reading the King James Version or the English Version. The King James Version of the Bible was translated from Koine Greek. Koine, of course, means common Greek. During the time of the writing of the book of the Bible, which the Bible was written in, they used primarily Koine Greek and Aramaic. Koine Greek, common Greek. And then it was translated from common Greek in 1611 to archaic English. Archaic English. And by archaic English, I'm talking about old-fashioned English. English words that were used in 1611 are not necessarily used in 2020. Words are like people, they undergo a change, if you will. And the word intermeddleth literally means to butt in. It means to interfere with. But in this case, it means its secondary meaning, which means to rage against, to interfere with. It means to butt in, but it also means to rage against, R-A-G-E, to rage against. So here, Solomon is saying, through desire, a man having separating himself. Let's look at the A section of this verse. And the A section of this verse says, through desire, a man having separated himself. Himself. Here, Solomon is trying to suggest to us that the man or the woman that isolates themselves seek their own desires. They're fully interested only in their own desires. Beloved, here Solomon describes for us the person or persons, listen carefully, that purposely cut themselves off from their family or their friends, and from both family and friends, for selfish reasons. For selfish reasons. They purposely separate themselves for selfish reasons. It shows how a person or persons are so unwilling to get along with other people. It also suggests to us in the B section of verse number 1, it says, through desire, a man having separated himself seeketh and intermeddleth, rages against all wisdom. Rages against all wisdom. Now, listen, This is what I believe this proverb is protesting in this verse. It's protesting against the self-satisfaction received from the person or persons who purposely separate themselves from other people, other family members, other friends, all because they have very little tolerance of other people's thoughts and other people's opinions. That's why they're only focused on their own opinions, because they have very little tolerance to listen to other people's thoughts and other people's opinion. Now, the Bible is clear here that this kind of person, the person who purposely separates themselves from people, purposely separate themselves for selfish reasons because they can hardly stand to hear what your thoughts are. They can hardly stand to hear what your opinions are. And they're only concerned about their opinions, not the facts, not the truth, but their take on things. Have you ever run into people who have no opinion based in fact, but they will not hear your thoughts? They won't take the time to listen to your opinion because they believe that their opinion is the only opinion that counts. Certainly you have run across people with that kind of mindset that has very little tolerance from hearing other people's thoughts and other people's opinion. Solomon calls this man, this woman, a separated man or a separated woman. So in verse number 1, Solomon purposely introduces us to the separated man, the separated woman. This person is only concerned about their own thoughts, their own opinions, and have very little tolerance for other people's thoughts and other people's opinion. Now, watch what Solomon does in verse number 1. What he does now, he makes a change. He makes a change, and now leaves talking about the separated man to talk about the selfish man. That's in verse number 2, the selfish man. Let's proceed to verse number 2, if you will, and let's see what Solomon has to say to us. In verse number 2, Solomon says, "A fool hath no delight in getting understanding, but that his heart may discover itself." That the heart may discover itself. It's verse number 2 is the first cousin of verse number 1, because he's pretty much saying the same thing, but giving it a different take. Because in verse number 1, he was talking about the separated man. But in verse number 2, beloved, he'll talk about the selfish man. Because really, the separated man is a selfish man, and the selfish man is a separated man. So verse number 2 is the first cousin of verse number 1. Pretty much, Solomon is saying the same thing, but saying it in a different and differing way. He says in verse number 2 that a fool has no delight in getting understanding, but rather is only interested in expressing what's on his heart and only sharing his own opinion, his own opinion. Now, notice, if you will, contrast and comparison, because the wise man and the wise woman receive great satisfaction from obtaining wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. The wise person, the wise man, the wise woman receive great satisfaction from getting knowledge, from getting wisdom, and getting understanding. Not so with the selfish man, or not so with the foolish man, or the unwise man or woman. They find no delight in obtaining knowledge. They find no delight in obtaining wisdom. They find no delight in coming to a real understanding of a matter. No, that's showing us again contrast and comparison with the wise and the unwise. The wise receive delight from receiving knowledge, from receiving wisdom, from receiving understanding. But the unwise, the foolish, those full of folly, detest getting knowledge. They detest getting wisdom. They detest receiving understanding. So the contrast and comparison between the wise and the unwise in verse number 2 is that the wise delight in receiving knowledge, they delight in receiving wisdom, and they delight in receiving understanding. Not so with the unwise, not so with the foolish, not so with those who are full of folly. They detest receiving knowledge. They detest receiving wisdom, and they detest receiving full understanding of matters. So in verse number 2, he spotlights this word on the selfish man. The selfish man. The selfish man is only interested in expressing his own settled opinions and his own settled take on things. You'll never change that kind of person's mind because their mind is already settled. Their minds are already made up, and they're not concerned with your opinion. They're not concerned with your thoughts. They're only concerned with the things that they have settled in their own hearts, in their own heads, in their own minds, and they're not concerned about facts. They're not concerned about the truth. They're only concerned about their take on things. So as you can see, the separated man and the selfish man have much in common, because a selfish man is selfish because he's a separated man, and a separated man is a separated man because in a real sense, he's a selfish man or woman, if you will. So in verse number 1, we looked at the separated man. In verse number 2, we see the selfish man. Now, let's look closely at verse number 3. We're looking at the sinful man. In verse number 3, 18th chapter of the book of Proverbs, verse number 3, we're looking at the sinful man. Here, Solomon introduces us to the sinful man. Look at the sinful man in verse 3, if you will. When the wicked cometh, then cometh also contempt, and with ignominy reproach. Let's read that again. With the wicked cometh then cometh also contempt, and with ignominy reproach. With ignominy reproach. Ignominy reproach. Let's unpack verse number 3, because there are several words that I want to define and describe for you, so we'll come to the same understanding about verse number 3. The first word I want to look at in verse number 3 is the word contempt. The word contempt. Now, contempt, as it's being used by Solomon in verse number 3, write this down, beloved. Contempt here literally means to lack respect. To lack respect. So in a real sense, what Solomon is really saying in verse number 3 is, whenever the wicked comes, then come also the lack of respect. The lack of respect. The lack of genuine respect. Yeah, disrespect, if you will. Yeah, disrespect, if you will. When you are contemptuous of someone, you lack respect for that person. You lack genuine respect for that person. Matter of fact, you have pure disrespect for something or someone. It also comes along with a strong dislike for something or a strong dislike for someone. Yeah, not only are you disrespectful, but you come also with a strong dislike for something or someone. So the Bible is literally saying whenever the wicked comes, wherever the wicked goes, along with that comes disrespect, comes a lack of respect, a lack of genuine respect for something or someone. So verse number 3 informs us that whenever the wicked comes, wherever the wicked goes, look for the lack of respect, look for disrespect, look for the lack of genuine respect for something or for someone. And along with this disrespect comes this superior attitude, if you will, that makes them think they're better than. Have you ever run across a person that not only lacks respect, not only lacks genuine respect, but they have this superior attitude about themselves to think they're better than? They are always better than the less than. Yeah, it allows them not only to feel superior to someone or something, they also look down their noses at other people who they think are less than themselves. That's why they lack genuine respect, because they don't feel you come up to where they are. So they have this superior attitude about themselves. Solomon says, be careful of the wicked, because with the wicked comes lack of respect, lack of genuine respect. Along with the wicked comes this attitude of disrespect, and that superior attitude of feeling like they're better than, and everybody else is always less than. Less than. That's the sinful man. That's the sinful man. Also, along with contempt, in verse number 3, this word ignominy. Now, the word ignominy literally means to dishonor. It means to dishonor. It means to scorn. It means to scorn. It means to insult, if you will. And what the wicked does, whenever the wicked comes, wherever the wicked goes, don't be surprised if they are shown a lack of respect, a lack of genuine respect, and then you will be bombarded by insults, verbal insults, because they not only disrespect you, they will dishonor you through insults and little tidbits and little words that will insult you because of this superior attitude of thinking they're better than and everybody else is less than. So look at what Solomon is really trying to tell us about the wicked. He says, when the wicked cometh, wherever the wicked goes, comes a lack of respect. So don't be surprised if you're disrespected and insulted and dishonored by the wicked, because they have no respect. They have no genuine respect for others. They feel they're better than everybody else. They feel like everybody else is less than. So look at what Solomon has shared with us thus far. In chapter 18, verse 1, the separated man. Verse number 2, the selfish man. In verse number 3, we have the sinful man. Now we proceed, beloved, to verse number 4. Verse number 4, the words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom is as a flowing brook. Verse number 4, the Bible is clear. The words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flourishing brook. As a flourishing brook. Now, let's unpack verse number 4. There's a lot there on the surface. And what I want to do is get my sanctified shovel tonight, and let's dig a little deeper to see what we can see in verse number 4, because it's a lot here. Now, in verse number 4, I want you to write down the thematic thought of the speaking man. That's what he's going to deal with in verse number 4, is the speaking man. Solomon's focus is on the speaking man. Let me hear you say speaking man. Yeah, that's where his focus is in verse number 4, is on the speaking man. Also, in verse number 4, underneath the climatic thought of the speaking man, put the anticlimactic thought underneath the speaking man. Write down these words: the man of deep words. The man of deep words for verse number 4. For verse number 4, you ought to have two things. Number one, the speaking man. That's what the focus is going to be about through verse number 8. But we're in verse 4 now. Verses 4 through 8 is going to be focusing in on the speaking man. But there's a particular kind of speaking man that he is referring to in verse 4. In verse number 4, he's talking about the man of deep words. The man of deep words. The man of deep words. In verse number 5, write this down, he leaves talking about the man of deep words, and then he talks about the man of deceitful words. That's in verse number 5. That's in verse number 5. Then he will close this in verse 6. In verse 6, under the banner of the speaking man, in verse number 6, he's going to talk about the man of destructive words. Destructive words. Now in verse number 4, his focus is on the speaking man. The speaking man. Under the speaking man, in verse 4, is the man of deep words. The man of deep words. In verse number 5, he's going to talk about the man of deceitful words. And then verse number 6, if you will, he's going to talk about the man of destructive words. Now, let's unpack the speaking man in verse number 4, and let's take a look at the man of deep words. The man of deep words. The Bible says in verse number 4 that the words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, as deep waters, as deep waters. And he goes on to say, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook. Let's unpack verse number 4. What is Solomon saying? Solomon is saying that the wise sayings of a man, of a wise man, that is, that the wise saying of a wise man can be just like being in deep waters. Just like being in deep waters. How so, brother preacher? And why would you say that? Well, let me share with you what he is saying by sharing with you and comparing and contrasting what he's not saying in this text. Let me tell you what he's not saying so you can better understand what he is saying. He's not saying that every word that proceeds out of everybody's mouth is deep or meaningful. He's not saying that. That's not what he's saying. Every word that everyone speaks is not deep. Matter of fact, we spend most of our times talking in shallow conversations, and the words that we speak are not deep and they're not meaningful. But here, Solomon says that the wise sayings of a wise man are just like being in deep waters. Yeah. He openly reveals to us that the wise saying of a wise man reveals the depth of our thinking that comes and proceeds from our hearts. Are you getting what I'm saying here? He's talking about the depth of our words because based upon the depth of our hearts, that our hearts reveal the depth of our words, the meaningfulness of our words, how deep our words can be or should be or will be. You see, it is the words that proceed out of the mouth, but they proceed from the heart. Because in a real sense, whatever the heart tries to conceal, the mouth can't help but to reveal. Did you hear what I just said? Whatever's down in the heart will come through the mouth. It'll come through the mouth. So here, Solomon is trying to share with us, he's trying to reveal to us the depth of our hearts. The depth of our hearts can be discerned by the words that comes out of our mouths, that comes out of our mouths. So here in section A, the Bible is clear. The words of a man's mouth can be just like deep waters, because the words that we speak, that a wise man speaks, that a wise woman speaks, should have depth and it should be meaningful, Any word that a wise person speaks, any word that a wise woman speaks should have depth and it should have meaning. It should have meaning. Then he says that not only are the words of a wise man or a wise woman have depth, have meaning, but he also talks about deep waters in the A section and flowing brooks in the B section. You see the contrast and comparison? He talks about still waters run deep. So he talks about deep waters in section A and a flowing brook in the B section of verse number 4. So he's talking about overall the man of deep words, verse number 4. When he talks about the wise man or wise woman, not only are the words like deep waters, it's like a flowing brook. It's like a flowing brook. When the wellspring of a man's being is rooted in wisdom, whenever the heart of a wise man or a wise woman is rooted in wisdom, it will flow from the heart to the mouth and it will reveal wisdom. Did you hear what I just said? Yeah. Flowing brook here is suggesting to us tonight that it paints the picture of a man's being, Now, what are we talking about, a man's being? Well, we're talking about what's on the inside of a man or a woman. When a man or a woman's heart is rooted in wisdom, it will flow from the heart to the mouth. It'll flow from the heart to the mouth. Whatever is on the inside will ultimately come up and out on the outside. So in verse number 4, he's talking about the speaking man, and he's talking about the man of deep words. The man of deep words. Remember, the man or woman of deep words shares from the depth of their hearts words that are meaningful and words that have depth. Words that have depth. Now, that's verse number 4. the speaking man. And in verse number 4, Solomon will talk about the man and of deep words, the man of deep words. Now he's going to transition from verse number 4 to verse number 5. What is he going to talk about in verse number 5, Brother Minister? Let's look and see. In verse number 5, again, he transitions from the man of deep words to the man of deceitful words. That's in verse number 5. In verse number 5. Am I making myself clear here? Now we've gone to verse number 5 from verse number 4. In verse number 5, the Bible says, "It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment." Listen at the word of God. It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, and simultaneously in accepting partiality with dealing with wicked men and women, you overthrow the righteous in judgment. What is Solomon talking about here? Solomon is talking about the man of deceitful words. Deceitful words. When you use deceitful words, you're using words that are at odds with your thinking, with your acting, and with your speaking. Yeah, whenever you are being deceitful, your actions, your thoughts are not consistent with your words, if you will. So here Solomon says, this is obvious to the man or woman that has a moral compass. If you have any kind of moral compass guiding you, guarding you, it is obvious to know that whenever you side with the wicked, you overthrow righteous judgment. You overthrow righteous judgment, or the judgment of the righteous. You have to have some kind of moral compass guiding you in what you do and guiding you in what you say. So it's obvious here that whenever you choose the person of the wicked, verse number 5, it is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment. That's obvious. That's obvious. But that doesn't stop people from doing it. Yeah, Solomon is saying this because although it's obvious that we overthrow righteous judgment when we side with the wicked, so many side with the wicked and thus overthrow righteous judgment, and they do it for many reasons. Many reasons. Some may do it out of misplaced compassion for somebody. Others may do it out of a desire to please other people. You know, oftentimes we have a strong desire to be liked. We have a strong desire to be accepted. So we do things, we compromise in many things just to be able to be accepted, just to be able to be received and liked by others. And then some do it as a result of some bribe or some gift, if you will. It clouds their thinking because they have been bribed, they've been given a gift, and that clouds their thinking and allows them to receive the wicked and overthrow the righteous in judgment. So the Bible warns us against partiality. This is what the Bible is talking about. This is what Solomon is talking about in verse number 5. He's really talking about partiality. The Bible warns us from Genesis to Revelation. The Bible takes no shortcuts in warning us against the danger of partiality. The danger of partiality. Matter of fact, Paul just comes out and says, and James comes out and says in no uncertain terms, that there should be no partiality mentioned among the saints of God. There should be no partiality. You treat one person one way and then you treat another person another way. James takes almost 12 verses and describes for us the danger of partiality. The danger of partiality. He talked about the ugly usher. He talked about the ugly usher. The ugly usher was ugly because he treated a man who had fine clothes on one way, took him down front, and then a man that may not look like we look and may not smell like we smell and may not do the things that we do, and set him in the back, all the way in the back. And James says that's a sign of partiality. And Bible warns us constantly against partiality. Partiality is a sin. Partiality is not some mistake. Partiality is a sin. It's a major sin in the eyesight of God, and it should not be mentioned among the saints of God. Was the saints of God. Now, here's what Solomon wants us to understand, that especially when partiality is at play, we overthrow the righteous in judgment. Whenever you choose to use partiality, you are literally overthrowing righteous judgment. You're literally overthrowing righteous judgment by showing partiality to the wicked. They will overthrow the righteous in judgment, whether they intended to do it or not. The mere fact that you're being partial automatically overthrows the righteous in judgment, whether you intended to do it or not to do it. In verse number 4, Solomon talks about the man and the man of deep words. But in verse number 5, he talks about the man of deceitful words, Now, let's look quickly at verse number 6. In verse number 6, he talks about the man of destructive words. Remember, this is under the banner of the speaking man, which we picked up in verse number 4. Then he talks about the man of deep words. That's verse number 4. The man of deceitful words, verse number 5. Now in verse 6, he talks about the man of destructive words. Now, also in verse number 6, write this down. He's talking about the man of destructive words, but he's talking about the destructive words that are muddled. It's the words of a muddled man. The words, I'm in verse 6. I'm still in verse 6. It's the word of a muddled man. Now, that's under the banner of the speaking man in verse 4. The destructive words in verse number 6. And under the destructive man, he's talking about a special kind of destructive man here in verse 6. He's talking about the words of a muddled man. And if your words are muddled, that literally means that your words are confusing. Your words are full of chaos and confusion. Your words are full of disorder, if you will, the muddled man. So he's really talking about a man whose words cause confusion, a man whose words cause chaos, a man whose words cause disorder. The Bible says in verse number 6, a fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calleth for strokes. His mouth calleth for strokes. Here, Solomon is sharing with us the very nature of a fool. It's the very nature of a fool to argue and start arguments. That's his nature. That's the nature of a fool. It's the nature of a fool to start arguments, and to create confusion and chaos. That's the words of a muddled man. A fool's lips enter into contention. Now, what does the word contention mean? The word contention here in verse number 6 literally means a heated disagreement. A heated disagreement. A fool's lips will always look for opportunities to start a heated disagreement. Make room and space, find space for a heated disagreement. It is the very nature of a fool to argue, to argue. Don't miss this. Solomon shares with us that it is the very nature of a fool. It is the very nature of a person whose heart is full of folly and foolishness. It is no surprise when they start heated arguments or start words that bring about contention. The contention, that's the A section of verse number 6. But the B section says in verse number 6, not only that a fool's lips entereth in contention, that's the A section. Listen at the B section. And his mouth calleth for strokes. His mouth calleth for strokes. Now, the B section is literally saying his mouth often calls for blows, physical blows, if you will. The contentious words of the fool oftentimes invite punishment. That's what Solomon is trying to share with us. Yeah, oftentimes that which comes from the lips of a fool is worthy of punishment. And sometimes it's so severe that it's worthy of physical punishment. Being corrected by the rod of correction. Oftentimes in the East, beatings, public floggings are legal in regard to putting out punishment for a particular infraction or a crime. In the East, they can beat you with a rod, and it's called the rod of correction. So here, Solomon is speaking from an Eastern mind and not a Western mind. We don't believe in flogging, oftentimes, depending on what the case is, and we're not talking about police brutality here. Solomon's talking about someone exacting punishment because of the words of a fool, the words of a fool. So sometimes it takes the rod of correction to correct the lips of a fool, the lips of a fool. So here he talks about the words of a destructive man, the words of a destructive man, and it talks about the words of a muddled man, the words of a man that causes chaos, causing confusion, causing disorder, and sometimes the words that proceed out of the mouth of a fool is worthy of physical correction, using the rod of correction to correct the words of a fool, the words of a fool. But I also want you to notice verse number 7. And after we look at verse number 7, I see my time is well spent. The lesson will be yours. Let's look at verse number 7. Verse number 7, if you will. Verse number 7 says, a fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. The snare of his soul. In verse number 7, let's look at this very closely. In verse number 7, he talks about the words of a fool again. He's still talking about the words of a fool, are words of one who is full of folly, full of folly. But notice, if you will, they always work towards his destruction. Where in verse number 6, Solomon talks about the fool's lips worthy of physical correction. But here he changes the script. He flips the script and says that the words of a fool lead to his destruction, his own personal destruction. He's trapped, he's tripped up and trapped in by his own words, So verse number 7 is a little bit different than verse number 6, because in verse number 6, he puts the emphasis on physical correction, but here he shows the destiny of a fool by the words that he uses and the words that he says. And the consequence of those words lead to his very own destruction. Many a fool has been ruined because of their own foolish words. That's what Solomon's trying to say. In the B section of that same verse, verse 7, he says, and in most cases in Proverbs, the word snare means to trap. It means to trap. So a fool is trapped by his own senseless words. By his own senseless words. He's being trapped and therefore destroyed by his own words. It's the consequence, if you will, of his own untimely words. A fool lives a trapped life. I want you to get this. He lives a trapped life because he's constantly saying words that snare, that trap, not only himself, but tries to trap other people. Now, in verse number 8, the words of the meddlesome man. Verse number 8, the meddlesome man. And meddle here means to butt in. It means to interfere with the affairs of others. There are some people who don't mind getting involved in your business when they should be taking care of their own business. And if you take good care of your own business, you don't have time to get in my business, because taking care of your own business takes up all your time, so you don't have time to get in somebody else's Kool-Aid. I'm here today to tell you that there are some meddlesome people in the world. Solomon points it out right here in verse number 8. He says, the words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Some says that the words of a talebearer are like trifles, and those are little sweet delicatessen sweets. It's delightful sweets, if you will, and it goes down into the innermost parts of our belly. Whichever you choose, wounds or trifles, whichever one you use, the text is the same, because here it talks about the meddlesome person, the person who's bent on interfering in your affairs, a person who doesn't mind butting in on your affairs. It talks about the gossip. That's what a person, a talebearer is a gossiper. Yeah, he's talking about the gossiper and the talebearer. When I thought about this, it's almost impossible to resist, even those of us who know better. It's difficult to resist little tidbits of gossip. Yeah, it's hard to say, stop, I don't want to hear that. It's difficult, even for those of us who know better. Yeah, it's hard, you get some juicy gossip, and your curiosity have the tendency to get the better of you. but there's a danger in listening to talebearers, especially if it cannot be confirmed by someone else or confirmed. That's why the Bible calls for 2 or 3 witnesses to establish something as being true. Yeah, that's why the Bible requires at least 2 or 3 other people who see it the same way in order to establish a fact as fact and truth as truth. But it's very difficult to say no to a juicy piece of gossip. Yeah, to a juicy, that gossip you got today. Yeah, you know you were wrong. But even those of us who know better, it's difficult to turn down a juicy piece of gossip. But I want you to know the danger in listening to gossip is that it forces you to change your opinion of how you see other people and how you feel about other people. It just does, whether it's true or not. If you listen to gossip, if you listen to talebearers, it'll change the way you see that person, and it will ultimately change how you feel about that person, even though it may not even be true. You see the danger of listening to idle gossip? Do you see the danger in listening to talebearers? It will ultimately change the way you see that person, the way you feel about that person, and it will ultimately change the way you treat that person, all because of something that may not even have any truth to it. I'm here today to tell you that beware of the gossiper, the talebearer, the meddlesome person who gets in your Kool-Aid and gets involved, butts in, and causes you to look differently at people. It'll cause you to see people differently. It'll cause you to feel differently about others, and it will cause you to treat others differently. That's our lesson for tonight. I see that my time is far spent. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and we're very thankful and hopeful that these lessons are beneficial to you in your everyday walk with the Lord. Please be mindful of the fact that Sunday we'll start our fall revival with Dr. Olu Shabazz, and we're waiting with temporal anticipation to hear what the Lord has to say to us this week, Sunday through Wednesday. Dr. Shabazz will be coming to us nightly at 7:30 Monday through Wednesday, and at 11 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Sunday morning. And we're looking forward to, please be in prayer for Dr. Shabazz, that God will choose to use him in an awesome way. Let's remember to pray for those that we're duty bound to pray for, and remember those who are sick among us, and also remember those who are suffering bereavement, and let's keep those families in prayer. Let's remember Brother Jones Sr. in prayer, along with the family, Brother Eddie Jones Jr., and also Sister Walker. We want to remember them in prayer. We want to remember Dr. Harrison and Sister Harrison, who's in the 4th stage of cancer. We want to remember these great soldiers of the cross and keep them petitioned before God's throne of grace. And while you're on praying ground, and if you don't mind, please remember my mother and father in your prayers, along with others who stand in the need of our prayers. Listen, beloved, it's far better to have God and not need him than to need God and not have him. If you walk with God, our God will walk with you. Remember to give us a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe. Remember to have watch parties and share the great word of God with others that you see stand in need of a word from the Lord. God bless.
From the highest of heights to the depths of the sea, create creations revealing your majesty. Oh, from the colors of fall to the fragrance of spring, every creature unique in the song that it sings, all exclaiming, indescribable, uncontainable. You place the stars in the sky, and you know them by name. You are amazing, God. All powerful, untamable, awestruck, we fall to our knees as we humbly proclaim. You are amazing, God, who sees lightning bolts and tells them where they should go, or sees heavenly storehouse laden with snow, who imagined the sun and gives source to its light, yet conceals it to bring us the coolness and light. None can fathom, indescribable, uncontainable. You place the stars in the skies, and you know them by name. You are amazing, God. Oh, yeah. All powerful, untamable, awestruck, we fall to our knees as we humbly proclaim. You are amazing, God. You are amazing, God. Indescribable, uncontainable. You place the stars in the sky, and you know them by name. You are amazing, God. Oh, yeah. Incomparable, unchangeable. You see the depths of my heart, yet you love me the same. You are amazing, God. You're so amazing. You are amazing, God. You're so amazing.